Most people don't suffer from a lack of ideas, they suffer from a lack of action. Iqbal would say, your thoughts, your dreams, your potential, none of it is real until your life starts speaking in the only language that reality understands: action. In Iqbal's philosophy, Khudi doesn't grow inside thought, it grows where responsibility turns conviction into action. Today, we explore why doing is the moment the self becomes real. Today, we continue our 50-part journey through Khudi, Allama Iqbal's masterpiece on the awakening and strengthening of the self. This is episode 14. Take a deep breath, come fully into this moment, and let the wisdom unfold. Action is the language of the self. Thought may clarify. Desire may ignite. Willpower may discipline. Fear may resist. But only action makes the self real. A self that does not act remains unfinished. It exists in potential, but never enters reality. Many live their entire lives inside thought. They think deeply, reflect endlessly, analyze endlessly. But thought without action is a closed circle. It returns to itself without producing transformation. The self is not built to remain internal. It is built to express itself through action. Action is not movement. Motion can be chaotic. Business can be empty. Action is intentional movement. Movement guided by responsibility. Responsibility separates action from impulse. Impulse reacts. Action commits. The self becomes visible only through what it does, not what it intends, not what it promises, not what it explains, but what it repeatedly enacts. Identity is written in the language of action. There is a dangerous belief that action must wait for certainty. Clarity first, then action. But in most lives, clarity arrives only through action. Waiting for clarity often becomes a sophisticated form of avoidance. The self grows by entering experience, not by predicting it. Action is how the universe tests sincerity. Desire speaks loudly, but action speaks truthfully. Everyone wants change. Few step into the cost of change. Action exposes what desire was real, and what desire was comfort disguised as longing. Responsibility begins the moment the self accepts that its life is its own task, not society's task, not fate's task, not circumstance's task. Accepting responsibility is the moment the self becomes adult. Many fear responsibility because responsibility eliminates excuses. Excuses protect the ego. Responsibility exposes it. But exposure is not destruction. Exposure is the beginning of growth. The self does not mature through knowledge alone. It matures through accountability. Accountability ties identity to outcome. When the self says, "This is mine to carry," strength awakens. Action is the bridge between the inner world and the outer world. What remains unacted upon stays theoretical. Theory may sound wise, but it does not transform life. Only lived truth does. The self is strengthened by bearing weight. Comfort weakens because it removes weight. Action strengthens because it adds weight. Responsibility gives gravity to existence. Without gravity, the self floats, directionless, unformed. The world does not assign meaning. Meaning emerges when the self responds to reality with deliberate action. Meaning is not discovered. Meaning is created. There is no neutrality in life. Not acting is still a choice. Avoiding responsibility is still a responsibility. One surrendered. Every moment either strengthens the self or weakens it. There is no pause. In becoming, the self learns its power only after it acts and survives the consequences. Fear exaggerates consequences. Action reveals reality. Reality is usually less destructive than imagination suggests. A self that never acts inherits fear secondhand. A self that acts develops first-hand knowledge. Knowledge born of action is stable. Belief born of speculation collapses easily. Responsibility awakens dignity. When the self carries its own burden, it stands upright. Dignity is not confidence. Dignity is ownership. Ownership of labor. Ownership of error. Ownership of outcome. Blame dissolves dignity. The moment blame becomes habit, the self begins to shrink. Blame transfers power outward. Responsibility pulls power inward. The self grows exactly where it takes responsibility. Action also clarifies values. What the self repeatedly does reveals what it truly values. Not words, not ideals, not intentions. Actions never lie. A person may speak of honesty, yet act in avoidance. May speak of courage, yet act in retreat. May speak of purpose, yet act in comfort. Action exposes hierarchy of values. What is acted upon stands highest. The self cannot remain divided. Once it acts decisively, indecision fragments identity. Decision unifies it. Even a difficult decision stabilizes the self. More than endless hesitation, action commits the self to a direction. Direction creates momentum. Momentum reduces fear. Fear feeds on stasis. Movement starves it. The world responds to action. Not always kindly. Not always immediately. but the world responds. It opens resistance. It opens opposition. It opens consequence. It opens learning. Through response, the self evolves. Action places the self into dialogue with reality. Without action, the self talks only to itself. Self-conversation eventually collapses into doubt or fantasy. Reality corrects distortion. Reality sharpens truth. The self must accept that mistakes are not proof of weakness. Avoidance is proof of weakness. Mistakes are tuition. Avoidance produces nothing but preservation. Preservation is not growth. Growth always risks error. There is a deeper fear beneath inaction. Not fear of failure. Fear of being changed. By responsibility, action transforms the self. Comfort preserves the old identity. To act is to consent to becoming someone else. Fear resists transformation. But transformation is the reason the self exists. The self is not meant to be protected. It is meant to be forged. Forging requires heat, pressure, and deliberate strikes. Action provides all three. Responsibility is the anvil upon which the self is shaped. Those who avoid responsibility remain soft. Those who embrace it become decisive. The self does not rise by avoiding weight. It rises by carrying weight skillfully. This is the dignity of action. Action demands acceptance of uncertainty. No meaningful action arrives with complete knowledge. If certainty were required, nothing real would ever begin. The self grows by stepping into partial understanding. Understanding completes itself through engagement, not contemplation. Those who wait for perfect plans often wait forever. Planning refines action, but it cannot replace it. Action creates data. Reality educates faster than speculation ever will. Responsibility also reveals limits. Not to imprison the self, but to educate it. Limits are not barriers. They are instructions. They show where strength must be developed, and where humility must be learned. A self that never encounters limits overestimates itself. A self that encounters limits honestly builds real power. Power is not illusion, power is capacity earned. Action makes time meaningful. Unacted intentions disappear into memory. Acted decisions leave traces. Time remembers action. History is not moved by ideas alone. It is moved by individuals who took responsibility for living those ideas. Responsibility personalizes life. Without it, life feels abstract, distant, unreal. With responsibility, every choice carries weight. Weight brings seriousness. Seriousness brings presence. Presence brings reality. Responsibility also simplifies life. When the self carries its role clearly, confusion decreases. The mind quiets. When direction is known, direction reduces unnecessary choice. Choice reduction increases strength. Many feel overwhelmed, not because life is too heavy, but because responsibility is scattered. They say yes without commitment. They act without ownership. They start without completion. Fragmented responsibility fractures energy. Focused responsibility concentrates it. The self must learn to say fewer yeses and make them count. Commitment multiplies power. Shallow involvement drains it. Action grounded in responsibility creates trust. Trust in oneself. Trust from others. Trust in the process of growth. A self that completes what it begins develops inner authority. This authority cannot be faked. Responsibility also teaches restraint. Not every impulse needs expression. Not every thought needs action. Maturity is not doing everything. Maturity is choosing wisely what must be done. Responsible action is selective. The self that learns restraint gains precision. Precision increases effectiveness. Effectiveness builds confidence. Confidence reinforces will. Will sustains direction. Direction shapes destiny. Irresponsible action creates chaos. It scatters consequences. Without accountability, chaos weakens both the self and the environment around it. Responsible action creates order. Not rigid order, but coherent alignment between intention and outcome. The self cannot demand meaning from life while refusing responsibility. Meaning emerges from involvement. Involvement demands ownership. Ownership demands action. Action clarifies belief. Belief held privately is weak. Belief acted upon becomes living truth. The self discovers what it truly believes only after acting. Words deceive. Action reveals. Responsibility deepens courage. To act repeatedly under responsibility strengthens the nervous system. The self becomes familiar with stress. Stress stops feeling like threat and begins feeling like signal. Signal of growth. Signal of engagement. Signal of becoming. The self that carries responsibility does not fear pressure. Pressure trains structure. Structure holds power. Pressure without structure breaks the self. Pressure with structure refines it. Inaction produces a silent decay. Days feel longer, but emptier. Energy drains without challenge. Purpose fades without resistance. The self begins to feel unreal to itself. This is not peace. It is stagnation. Many mistake stagnation for rest. But rest restores. Stagnation erodes. Rest prepares for action. Stagnation avoids it. The self must distinguish between the two. Action keeps the soul awake. It prevents the numbness that comes from disengagement. The self was not created for endless observation. It was created for participation. Participation binds the self to the world, not as victim, not as spectator, as contributor. Contribution gives the self a place in existence. Place creates belonging. Belonging stabilizes identity. Responsibility also reveals consequence. Every action alters the field of reality. Even small acts ripple outward. The self learns that it matters, that it affects others, that it carries weight. This knowledge matures the soul. A powerless self feels insignificant. A responsible self knows it carries influence. Influence demands care. Care deepens ethics. Ethics humanize power. The self becomes ethical, not by memorizing rules, but by carrying responsibility. Responsibility generates conscience. Conscience refines action. Refined action cultivates integrity. Integrity is the harmony between inner decision and outer behavior. Action is where integrity is tested. Integrity cannot exist in abstraction. A person who avoids responsibility avoids growth. A person who accepts responsibility evolves inevitably. There is no plateau in responsibility. It pulls the self forward or pushes it downward. Neutrality is illusion. The self must choose which burden it will carry: the burden of responsibility or the burden of regret. Both are heavy. Only one transforms. Action does not ask whether we feel ready. It asks whether we are willing to learn through experience. Experience is the most honest teacher. It charges tuition, but it offers mastery. Every act of responsibility expands capacity. The self notices it can carry more than expected. This realization builds confidence. Confidence invites larger responsibility. Growth compounds. This is how strength is built. Responsibility gives shape to freedom. Freedom without responsibility turns self against itself. Freedom with responsibility becomes creativity. The self begins to shape rather than merely consume life. When action rises from responsibility, life gains texture. Each day carries significance. Each effort matters. Each task contributes to becoming. Monotony lifts when meaning enters. Meaning enters through responsibility. The self does not need grand acts. It needs faithful action. Small responsibilities carried well. Build character. Character forms destiny. The self that becomes reliable becomes powerful. Power flows to what can be trusted. The world resists unpredictability, but opens to steadiness. Steadiness is built through action. Responsibility teaches endurance. Endurance is the ability to continue without drama. Drama exhausts the self. Endurance sustains it. Sustainable action outlasts intensity. The self learns that greatness is not enthusiasm. Greatness is stamina. Stamina grows only through responsible repetition. In time, the self begins to feel at home in action. What once felt heavy now feels natural. Responsibility integrates into identity. The self no longer asks whether it should act. It acts because this is who it has become. There comes a moment when the self understands that action is not a phase of life. It is the condition of life. To stop acting is not to rest. It is to withdraw from existence. Action is how the self confirms that it is alive, awake, and committed to becoming. Without action, the self fades into intention. With action, the self sharpens into reality. Responsibility, carried long enough, changes the way the self sees the world. The world stops appearing as something that happens to us. It begins to appear as something that responds to us. This shift is subtle, but profound. The self moves from victim to participant, from observer to builder, from consumer to creator. The creator does not wait for perfect conditions. Creation begins with what is available. Weakness is addressed through effort. Ignorance is addressed through learning. Fear is addressed through movement. Every limitation becomes material once the self accepts responsibility. Action exposes the illusion of helplessness. Helplessness thrives in thought without movement. Once the self moves, even imperfectly, the illusion collapses. Momentum replaces despair. Direction replaces anxiety. Capability replaces doubt. The self does not discover power by imagining it. Power emerges through repeated responsibility. Responsibility taken seriously creates inner authority. Authority felt internally changes how the world responds externally. The self begins to notice that life offers resistance only where growth is possible. Resistance is not hostility. Resistance is engagement. The universe pushes back to test the strength of intention. Weak intention collapses. Strong intention adapts. and intensifies. Action also teaches timing. Not every action must be immediate. Not every pause is avoidance. Wisdom learns when to press and when to wait. But waiting is purposeful, not passive. Purposeful waiting maintains readiness. Passive waiting erodes it. The responsible self does not collapse in delay. It prepares. Preparation is action. Beneath visibility, invisible action still shapes the self. Responsibility grows the self, even when no one is watching. This is where integrity is formed. Integrity is not performance. Integrity is alignment, maintained in solitude. The self becomes strong when it acts correctly. In private, public recognition is irrelevant to real growth. A self grounded in responsibility is not easily shaken by failure. Failure becomes feedback, not identity. The responsible self learns quickly because it listens. Without self-pity, learning accelerates. When blame dissolves, action matures the emotional life. Emotions stop feeling overwhelming when they are integrated into movement. Anger transforms into resolve. Fear transforms into vigilance. Anxiety transforms into preparation. Desire transforms into commitment. Unexpressed emotion stagnates. Expressed through action. Emotion organizes energy. Responsibility gives emotion direction. Direction prevents chaos. Chaos fragments the self. Directed energy builds coherence. Coherence creates presence. The disciplined self does not seek motivation. It seeks alignment. Motivation fluctuates. Alignment endures. Responsibility sustains alignment across changing emotional states. As responsibility deepens, complaints diminish. Complaints are signs of powerlessness. Action removes the need for complaint. The self no longer asks why life is difficult. It asks how difficulty can be shaped. This question changes everything. Responsibility also humanizes ambition. Ambition without responsibility becomes exploitation. Ambition with responsibility becomes contribution. The self learns that its growth must not destroy the growth of others. True power stabilizes. False power consumes. The responsible self develops respect for consequences. Every action echoes. Every decision shapes environment. This awareness breeds care. Care refines intention. Refined intention purifies action. Ethics emerges naturally from lived responsibility. Responsibility anchors the self into time. Each day becomes meaningful. Tasks accumulate. not as burdens, but as proof of participation. Life becomes dense with effort. Effort gives texture to existence. The responsible self does not rush toward reward. It understands that reward is secondary. Transformation is primary. What the self becomes is more important than what it gains. Gains fade. Becoming remains. Action removes abstraction from philosophy. Ideas become flesh. Concepts become habit. Beliefs become behavior. Philosophy enters blood and bone. Only then does it matter. The self realizes that freedom was never the absence of obligation. Freedom was the ability to choose meaningful obligation, to choose one's burden, to carry it willingly, to shape oneself through it. This is why the self was created to act, not to float through existence, not to observe from distance, but to engage, to struggle, to build, to take responsibility for becoming real. A life lived in action does not avoid pain, but it also does not drown in it. Pain becomes part of the process, not the center of identity. Process replaces paralysis. Movement dissolves despair when the self looks back on a life lived with responsibility. It does not tally comfort. It recognizes contribution. It sees what was built. It feels weight carried. This weight was meaning. The self does not ask whether acting was easy. It asks whether acting was true. Truth carried into action is the highest form of courage. There is no final refuge in thought alone. Thought without action remains incomplete. Action without responsibility becomes chaos. Responsibility without action becomes guilt. The balance of all three creates integrity. The self reaches maturity when action becomes natural, not forced, not dramatic, but steady, quiet, unavoidable, like breathing, like standing upright. At this stage, the self no longer seeks permission. It acts because this is what it means to be alive, to be human, to be awake, to be worthy of its own potential. In action, the self discovers what it was meant to become, and through responsibility, it remains faithful to that discovery.